Good morning and good afternoon and good evening to all of you. And thank you for joining us today for this ECOSOC Humanitarian Affairs segment, a side event on collective efforts to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, lessons learned and the way forward. My name is Mervat Shilbeya and I'm the head of the IASC Secretariat, which is the Interagency Standing Committee Secretariat. And I'm truly honored to be facilitating today's discussion. So, colleagues, we've all witnessed the devastating impact of the COVID-19 pandemic across the globe. And almost a year and a half now since the declaration of the pandemic as a public health emergency of international concern, we continue to witness the impact of this unprecedented crisis, perhaps even so at an accelerated rate in fragile countries and humanitarian settings. And that's not only in terms of the immediate impact of the pandemic on millions more who are in need of humanitarian assistance and protection. And many of you may have seen, or I hope you have seen, the Global Humanitarian Overview, which has demonstrated, again, a significant increase in the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance and protection, with a projected number of 235 million people in need of assistance and protection. This is a 40% increase compared to the 2020 figures, and requiring around $35 billion to be able to respond to these critical needs. So in addition to the immediate impact, we're also witnessing medium and are concerned around the long-term socioeconomic impacts on millions of the most vulnerable around the world as a result of this pandemic. So this session is really an opportunity to reflect on how the system, through the Interagency Standing Committee members and critically its partners, have worked, including with governments and local actors, to respond to this unprecedented crisis. It'll be an opportunity to look at and discuss the highlights, the impact that the COVID-19 continues to have on vulnerable communities around the world, especially in fragile countries and in humanitarian settings. And also we'll have the chance to talk about what needs to be done as a system, collectively, with partners, with governments on the ground to minimize this impact. With that, I'm truly pleased that we are joined today by a distinguished panel to speak to us to these issues. So first, I'd like to welcome Dr. Gwen Tang, who is the Deputy Director of the Asia and Pacific Regional Office of IFRC. She was previously the Secretary General of the Philippines Red Cross, having worked there for more than 15 years in various capacities. So welcome again, Dr. Gwen. I'm also very pleased that we're joined by Ms. Jennifer Nielsen, who is the Director of World Vision's COVID-19 Emergency Response Team. She began her career with World Vision in South Sudan in 2010 and served across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East since then. And under her leadership, World Vision's COVID-19 emergency response has served more than 62 million people spanning 70 countries. Welcome, Jennifer. Also, we have with us Mr. Peter Graaff. Good to see you, Peter. Peter is the Director of Special Initiatives with the World Health Organization. He previously served as Ebola Crisis Manager for the UN's mission in Liberia and was acting special representative of the UN Secretary General for the Ebola response there. He served previously as a WHO representative in various countries, including Afghanistan, Haiti, and Liberia, and has over 30 years of professional experience, both with the World Health Organization as well as the UN Secretariat. Welcome to you as well, Peter. Mr. Stephen Kahl is the Director of Logistics and Field Support with the World Food Programme. He previously served as a Global Logistics Cluster Coordinator and also as Head of Logistics in Ethiopia. Stephen played a central role in designing, implementing, and overseeing the World Food Programme's common services, which supported over 400 organizations in continuing their existing humanitarian operations, as well as responding to the global COVID-19 crisis. Thanks a lot, Stephen, for joining us as well today. Last but not least, really pleased that we're also joined by Ms. Wafaa Saeed. Wafaa is the Acting Director of Ocha's Coordination Division. Prior to that, she served as a Deputy Humanitarian Coordinator for Ethiopia and also as Deputy Director of Advocacy and Operations with the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. She has more than 20 years of experience with the UN, working for Ocha, the World Food Programme, and UNICEF, having served in various countries, including Sudan, Somalia, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Syria. So welcome again, Wafaa, and huge appreciation to all of our panelists for being part of today's discussion. So colleagues online, as with usual practice, what we will do is we will hear from the panelists. I will be posing a number of questions to our panelists. And then with usual practice, we will open the floor for comments, for questions, for feedback, for advice. So please do use the chat box to share your thoughts or flag any questions that you might have. And myself and the team, Ali and Dareen, will help in terms of channeling the questions to the relevant panelists. Okay, so with that, I'd like to perhaps start with you, Wafaa. So Wafaa, again, is with the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. So Wafaa, the Interagency Standing Committee members and partners moved swiftly and scaled up operations to prepare for and respond to the COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts in support of governments and local actors. From your experience and where you sit as well, Wafaa, and of course, Ocha is there to support the Emergency Relief Coordinator's role as chair of the IASC. Can you share a few highlights of the IASC's coordinated efforts to respond to this unprecedented crisis? What are some of the best practices and key lessons learned from the IASC's collective response that you can share with us? Over to you, please, Wafaa.
Okay, good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you so much, Mervet. And so maybe I'll just say a few things. As you mentioned, first, the Interagency Standing Committee, the principles, one of the things that they have done in the response to the COVID-19 crisis is to really come together very quickly and to work in a very coordinated way. And I think one of the most significant thing was that a scale-up was activated for all the countries where the system, the humanitarian system, had an international supported response, what we call the humanitarian response plan. So this was done not in certain countries, it was done across the countries that we support as the international humanitarian system. And the scale up by itself, its activation meant that we don't do business as usual, that all the bureaucracy in terms of procedures, procurement, getting the people that we require is all fast tracked as part of the scale up. And also all the internal resources are also sort of like mobilized very quickly. So I think that was one concrete thing that was done collectively. The second thing is support quickly for resource mobilization, because we know that the needs created by COVID come on top of large-scale existing protracted needs. And I think so to come collectively around resource mobilization was a critical issue, and around 3.8 billion has been mobilized collectively through a plan. And I have to say the plan in the beginning was done at agency level, at the headquarter level. And then as we had more time, it moved to the country level, and we reached a stage where it was mainstreamed in the already ongoing plan. And I think also this ability to come together, to do quickly, to use like a top line ask so that we can get the funds and then work with the respective countries. Also, the country-based pool fund and the Central Emergency Response Fund that are actually also managed through an advisory board, managed in a collective way. They provided close to 500 million to support the response to COVID-19. And as part of the specific deliverables that are quite important and with an impact, and I know that we have WFP colleagues on that, they can speak about this, because also with COVID-19, we all face the challenge about movement and mobility. I think WFP, as part of the Interagency Standing Committee, the lead in logistics, they really supported setting up a large-scale logistic response, allowing humanitarians to travel, allowing medevac. So I think that was very, very helpful. And also, we have also seen, Mervat spoke about some of the secondary impact. And I think we've seen that the issue of gender and based violence has been terrible. You know, with COVID-19, there was an increase in violence against women and girls. And I think many of the principles have also come together to prioritize and to provide more response to address the issue of gender and based violence. And also, you know, there was a bit of also people could not go to school where it's possible, because we know in many contexts it's not the same. People could also support what you call remote learning. And also one of the things, we all know that on the front line, we have the national actors, the local NGOs. So I think the agencies also made a step change in terms of reducing the administrative burden and also engaging with some of the donors to provide more flexible funding. So we have made also at the COVID, because of necessity and that there is no time and the frontline agencies were on the ground, it meant that the agencies had to also adjust to provide them with more resources. So that also has happened through a number of the agencies and through a number of the donors. And I think maybe one thing that we have also seen, and Merfat, you mentioned something about lessons learned. We're really facing a very critical challenge because we are focusing on the countries that are supported by the principles. And these are countries, it means already they don't have capacity to cope with large-scale humanitarian needs. And then on top of that, we have COVID. And there was concern that what about the people who could be in displacement camps, who could be refugees, who could be in places difficult to reach? What's going to happen to these people that at the same time they don't have enough access to sanitation, to clean water in crowded settings? So there was attention to that, and as part of the COVAX facility, there was a discussion also by the principals to have what we call the humanitarian buffer, and that is at least 5% should be kept to, if there are very vulnerable communities, they should be reached through vaccination. And I think right now, this is something that is very critical and will continue to be a priority for the principals on what to do about vaccination, because in these countries, only 22 million doses, which is like 1.3%, in settings that are really, people are struggling, they don't have capacity. This comes up of so many needs. So it's a really very dire, serious situation. It has to be on top of our, awareness raising, mobilizing for support. And not only the vaccination by itself, but also mentioned Mervat, you mentioned the issue about socioeconomic impact. It's going to be with us, until I would say around the same time next year. I think the projection that we are going to see that. So I think maybe one thing that we have to see, the provision of flexible funding, quality funding to the local NGOs, and to more support to local NGOs. This is something we have to say, it's the right thing to do. How can we, that we have seen demonstrated in COVID-19, how can we continue this thing in a sustainable way and scale it up? I think that is something that we should be thinking about as part of the lessons learned. Another thing that I would also maybe would like to flag, I mentioned the issue of the COVAX, and we have to continue on that, because the most ideally, people should also be included in national plans. That's what we are advocating for, in the national plans of the countries. But if not, we have to have some sort of like a backup to address that. And also, I think COVID-19 has shown the fragility and that we also need to address the root causes of this needs of the people. People don't really have resilience. They cannot cope, which means that how can we work better with our colleagues from the development sector in a very concrete way to address resilience. And we know, I think we have experts from WHO, we know that this is not going to be the last pandemic. We're talking about pandemic preparedness. So how can we build governance system, and we work with our colleagues from the development system. I have to say also this whole issue about protection, about listening to the people, about communicating to the people in terms of accountability to affected people, I think it's an area that we are still struggling to make progress, but I think in terms of the COVID-19, it came as something very important, and where we have to see where we take it to the next level, not only just consulting with the people, but to be able to adapt a response and to communicate with them. Merfat, I know many colleagues will be coming in, but let me stop here. Thank you so much.
Great, many thanks, Wafaa, and thanks for highlighting again the not only in terms of what the system, which is we're talking about the Interagency Standing Committee members, which is comprised of some of the largest, I would say, UN agencies, not only UN agencies, but also international non-governmental organizations, as well as the Red Cross, Red Crescent, IFRC, as well as ICRC and the World Bank. So what their role has been in making sure that they coordinate their efforts to scale up and ensure that they are in a better position to support governments and local actors to prepare for and respond to this unprecedented crisis. So the resources that were deployed, the procedures that have been reviewed to make sure that we're able to act quickly and in a coherent fashion, the trust and that the donors have also had in the system in terms of, again, the amounts of funds or resources that were mobilized to support the system to do what is necessary to respond on the ground. And I'm also happy that you've mentioned some of the important lessons learned or innovative solutions and good practices, including with the critical partnership that we have with Gavi, and also securing this 5% of the humanitarian buffer for high-risk populations in fragile and humanitarian, settings. But thanks also in terms of also talking, of course, about the areas in which this crisis has really shed light on areas that require further attention and work, including how we can be more responsive and accountable to affected people, the importance of working more with local actors, and what needs to be done to push forward the localization agenda. So with that, I'd like to actually, this is a good leeway to turn to Ms. Gwen Tang, who is again the Deputy Director of the Asia Pacific with IFRC. So Gwen, the pandemic has reinforced once again, and to the point that Wafaa mentioned, it has reinforced once again that more needs to be done to work with and through local actors who are best placed ultimately to respond to the needs within their communities. It would be great, Gwen, if you can perhaps share the lessons regarding the critical role of local action in response to COVID based on your experience through the IFRC. And what more can the IASC and partners do to do better and more in delivering on the localization agenda? Over to you, please, Gwen.
Thank you very much, Mervat. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting the IFRC to this side event. So I am representing our Asia Pacific office. So as we all know, the Asian region was the first epicenter of the COVID-19 across the region. The pandemic ranged from widespread community transmission to countries that were even believed to have 0 cases. So today we are, up and about in supporting many of the national societies, especially in South Asian societies, continuously with the current, wave. So this is a global and local response in as far as the IFRC is concerned. So over the past 1.5 years, we were able to reach millions of people. So we were able to support 4.2 million people on psychosocial support and mental health support, 40 million people on wash, sanitation, and hygiene. We were able to support 863,000 of people on shelter and cash support. 45 million people were given food assistance. 35 of our national societies out of 38 in Asia Pacific are actually actively involved in the vaccine program rollout, and many and there are other initiatives that we have done. We will not be able to do all of this without community engagement. So this is actually the core and integral part of what actually we're doing on the ground together with our national society. So for the past 1.5 years, we were able to mobilize 243 million volunteers, with risk communication and risk engagement activities during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's why community engagement is for us is a very important part of our work. Now, in terms of from our COVID-19 response, especially in Asia Pacific region, there are several lessons learned. However, I would like to maybe share 2 key lessons and also some best practices. So the first one is, the approach that we do, as I've said, integral part of our operation is always a community-centric approach in terms of preparedness, response, and recovery. And in COVID-19, it's a community-centric pandemic response. So as we all know, epidemic and pandemic starts and ends with community. Developing community level, so developing and reinforcing, engaging and empowering the community capacity, especially of the local actors and volunteers, to do so is key in curbing the epidemic and pandemic, especially in addressing trust and access issues. So in COVID-19 pandemic, borders are closed, international travel is restricted, and the clock is ticking to contain the spread of the virus. In such circumstances, it is, our local volunteers who step up and deliver as swift as possible the humanitarian action that are essential to save lives. Our COVID-19 response, especially in engaging the community and local leaders, was built from the work and investment done through the different preparedness and response work in the past. So this is a key lesson, I believe, because I think what you invest is very important. And now, because we have active volunteers on the ground, we have good engagement at the community level and also engagement with the local actors. And this was not done overnight, not because of this COVID-19 pandemic. As you all know, we have been, working at the ground level ever since. So this is a work that has been built from the past. And thanks to all the partners and donors who have put in, support to the community engagement work. But still, there are a lot of challenges in this one. It's not just like that. So, not all states, can reach all their populations through health services. So we cannot therefore expect the epidemic and pandemic response to succeed based solely on existing health infrastructure and trust in public health services. So it is important that we have partnership, with community-based organizations, with humanitarian organizations, with the local actors, in reaching people who otherwise would have not been served by the public health services. I want to give some examples. For instance, the Nepal Red Cross Society, the volunteers have been going door to door to support national COVID-19 operation. The Nepal Red Cross Society volunteers are disseminating key messages regarding the importance of maintaining public health measures in local and also that is in local dialects in remote communities. So they have trained volunteers in the communities that listen and inform and reassure people that maintaining key public health measures during pandemic can really save lives. So they even they reach the far-flung areas in Nepal. So on vaccination, for instance, through the community engagement, we were able to support the national COVID-19 immunization program in different countries. So as I mentioned earlier, 35 national societies out of 38 in Asia Pacific are engaged in the vaccination rollout. So there are 3 challenges in vaccination efforts, as we all know. That's supply, delivery, and access. Supply is not the key responsibility of the community, but the community the local actors, they have key roles in delivery and access to vaccines. So the delivery of vaccine doses at the airport or tarmac is half the job done. So we need to make sure that the local-based organizations and local leaders, will be able to support to reach, to have the vaccine reach the arms of the most vulnerable. So we need to listen to people's concern and address them while making sure that they have accurate information and available information when they need it. Across Asia, there are positive signs that attitudes are shifting as the vaccine rollout are underway. However, because of the recent surge cases in COVID-19, especially in South Asia, it's bringing it brought emotion and volatile at the volatile level. So that's why the work of the communities and community actors are very important in modeling and assuring people that and also disseminating information that vaccine can protect and can save lives. So the Maldivian Red Cross Society, Red Crescent Society, is ensuring no one is left behind. So this is a very important role of the local actor. So especially on undocumented non-citizen who are unable to register with the Ministry of Health, are issued by the Maldivian Red Crescent Society with vaccination card. And this information are shared with health authorities to avoid any potential immigration enforcement. So over half of the approximately 5,000 undocumented non-citizens have received their first dose. And this is because of the support of the local actors. So in Bangladesh, we have also seen that the current in the current rate, of the vaccination rollout, it will take 3 to 4 years to vaccinate the target population of Bangladesh. Support is urgently needed to ramp up vaccination program, especially targeting the most vulnerable population. So we are working very closely on the world's largest population movement camp in Cox's Bazar. To date, the Bangladesh Red Crescent Society have mobilized more than 2,000 volunteers to support 1,000 vaccination vaccination administration centers. So it is really important that, in mobilizing community actors and especially, the frontline volunteers, that we have to also make sure, that we do it by COVID safe programming. That is the cornerstone of the Red Cross Red Crescent COVID-19 operation. We rely on our staff and volunteers and volunteer network who are working at the community level to reach those in need. Therefore, it is the institution's responsibility to ensure that our staff and volunteers and those that we mobilize are healthy and safe. So we are investing also in volunteer insurance, business continuity plan, risk analysis, training, psychosocial well-being, and providing safety equipment like PPE, is vital. Another lesson another thing that I want to take up here is the collaboration. Collaboration is the key. So in the IFRC, we co-led the Global and Regional Risk Communication and Community Engagement Working Group together with WHO and UNICEF. So we felt that this is a very, very important work that we have to collaborate. We cannot do the work alone as an organization, a single organization. We have to really do it because only in collaboration that we can put our acts together and we can actually share resources and do it at scale. So as co-chair of the Asia Pacific Regional Community and risk communication and community engagement working group, the IFRC has co-led and has supported countries in developing guidance notes, numerous webinars, online trainings, connecting relevant organizations for more cohesive response, and also cross-country perception survey. Aside from that, at the global level, our global team is working with global immunization team on COVID vaccine and equitable vaccine distribution. Regionally, we are part of the regional working group on vaccine, which are constantly supporting equitable distribution of vaccine, which promoting risk communication and risk and community engagement. Now, in terms of recommendation, like what you're saying, Mervet, how do we deliver localization agenda together? So the IFRC has been striving for a model that is as local as possible, as global as necessary, in line with the localization commitment that we made in the World Health Summit in 2016. So local actors have clear areas of strength leading to an improved humanitarian response. So they are swift in action. They have access to hard to reach areas and population. They have a strong understanding of local circumstances and culture, and generally are cost effective. So partners, I believe, can commit, in there are 4 broad areas, but I would like to make a very practical, maybe recommendation. So for IASC and partners to support, I think, multi-year investment in capacity building of local actors and communities to be better prepared for recurrent outbreaks. Like what I have mentioned earlier, that the work that we have done today are actually built on from the work in the past. And these were from investment, to the local community and local actors from the past operations and past preparedness program. So we should achieve this perhaps through collaboration with development partners and incorporate capacity strengthening in partnership agreements, while recognizing the importance of partnership with communities in pandemic preparedness and response. Also, I think it is very important to regard the localization agenda as a strategy rather than an empowerment. I think it's a way of seeing things, and we should really move the commitment to implementation and reach what and achieve, and deliver what we have committed in the grand bargain and especially in the localization agenda. So thank you very much, Mervet. Over to you.
Super helpful, Gwen, and absolutely clear. Again, some of the critical points that you've mentioned, again, is the importance of investing early, not only when the crisis hits, but the importance of investing and engaging with local communities, with local actors as early as possible on preparedness activities, on response activities, so that once the crisis hits, we're better able to respond in an as effective way as possible. You also spoke about the importance, again, every stakeholder has a role. So the governments have a role. What do we need to do to make sure that we reinforce and complement the role of government, especially when public health infrastructure is stretched or is limited? What more can be done to work with local communities and organizations with the support of international actors to make that possible? You also spoke about critically the importance of building trust, and that's why the engagement with local actors and communities is critical to address some of the trust deficit or the concerns or the suspicions that some communities have, especially vis-a-vis the vaccine, and how you were able to overcome that with strengthened or improved information, not only information sharing, but also a more robust engagement with local communities, which can only be done or done in an efficient way by capitalizing on the strength and the capabilities of local actors. Super interesting to also hear about, again, the undocumented citizens that have received vaccines, which was also only able to be done based on the trust that was built with some of the local actors that you've mentioned, the good examples from Nepal, as well as Bangladesh, as well as others. And thanks for highlighting that. Even with, again, you mentioned a huge number, 243 volunteers, that a key part of what IFRC does through the Red Cross and Red Crescent movements on the ground is the duty of care aspect of working with volunteers. So thanks for highlighting this important piece. On the WHS commitments, again, as international, as local as possible and as international as necessary, thanks for highlighting that from the World Humanitarian Summit of 2016. And again, for sharing some key recommendations in terms of how we can do this better as a system. And so much, not so much in terms of capacity building, but maybe capacity sharing, because there's a lot that we need to learn from local communities, and a lot that we can also be shared from international actors and engaging with local communities. So thanks for highlighting some very concrete and specific examples of how that can be done, including by inclusion of these aspects of capacity sharing within partnership agreements, working with development actors, and so on. So thanks so much, really, Gwen, for highlighting these very concrete examples of strengthening the localization agenda, or making sure that we deliver better and more on the localization agenda. For colleagues online also, just for them to be aware, the IASC is in the process of also finalizing, I would say, a framework or guidance on what the IASC can do to strengthen engagement with local actors. So that's going to be the first time actually that the IASC produces this guidance. And I suspect within the next few weeks, it should be produced and it will be available for all colleagues online and the larger communities. So perhaps with that, I'd like to turn Stephen. So Stephen Cahill is the Director of Logistics and Field Support with the World Food Programme. Stephen, thanks again for joining. So Stephen, so the importance of coordinated action and the provision of critical common services to support the system's ability to stay and deliver life-saving assistance and protection has been paramount, including during the response to this unprecedented crisis. From your perspective, Stephen, because I know you've taken quite a critical role in fielding this common service, especially the logistics around the supporting the response on the ground. What are some of the key takeaways from WFP's experience in establishing and maintaining such a system that you can share with colleagues online? Over to you, please, Stephen.
Thank you so much, Mervat. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening, colleagues. A couple of takeaways, and I think I'd probably like to start off by saying is, WFP is not known as a health responder, right? I think we first got involved in health responses in Ebola in 2014 and 15. And we did quite a bit of work post that, especially with WHO, is about what lessons can we learn at that stage. And it's really interesting looking back at now and seeing that many of the lessons we learned actually became reality, right? So many of the aspects we thought around the disruption to international travel, both for cargo and for passengers, we had foreseen. We'd foreseen that the necessity to ensure that borders were kept open. Many of these things we had foreseen. We had not foreseen two things. One was the speed that the pandemic would carry, and the second part, of course, we'd very much built our scenarios around a pandemic hitting those countries with fragile health systems. And of course, the exact opposite happened. The fact that the second epicenter was in Italy, where WFP's headquarters were, was quite ironic, of course, and of course, which caused us major disruptions. So the other point as well, of course, is that in that preparedness was that we saw that preparing as humanitarians is one part, but if we're preparing that in isolation without interacting with the private sector, then of course, really what we do is the foundations of what we do, I wouldn't say are particularly strong, right? So again, we go back to the fact that in essence, last year, we saw the passenger airline come to a complete standstill. And of course, considering that about 60% of international cargo moves in the underbelly of passenger aircraft, that has a major impact on our business, right? Then looking back on last year, I think one thing is that in essence, I look back in huge pride in what we do. I also look back and I'd never like to do it again because it required such a heavy lifting in all of us, yeah? My hair stands testament to some of the difficulties that we had on that, right? It does serve as enormous credit, though. When we need to do it, we're able to do it. When we need to sit around and get over those hurdles, last year we were able to do it. All those internal discussions about who's doing what and whenever when, it came to the crux of the argument, we were actually able to stand up and respond collectively. And I think that's something we should look back with some form of pride, yeah? However, of course, there are still a lot of things to be learned. And I think that's also what we need to focus on in this conversation today. Just to give you an overview of what we did last year from WFP, there was three components to it. The cargo, we moved 150,000 cubic meters to 173 countries. Half of those countries don't have a WFP presence. So again, that goes back to the collective, right? The value of where people have presence, how to ensure that we're getting there. We moved 30,000 passengers around the world. Again, going back to airlines, in essence, suspended operations for a number of time. There's no point in getting cargo in if you can't get people in. And then third point, of course, ensuring that staff are looked after. So we conducted 173 medevacs, right? On the lessons learned is one thing is that we can't work in isolation, right? The link up with the private sector. So in the sense that I think that in some ways our dialogue with the private sector has always been, what can we learn from the private sector? And I think that dialogue needs to shift a little bit. The dialogue needs to be now, actually, what can we teach the private sector? And I mean, what can we teach the private sector in keeping in situ when a country or there's a global shock? How do we keep airlines running? How do we keep ships going? How do we keep borders open? And that's something that we can teach the private sector, and we need to, because we know when the private sector pulls out, the humanitarians need to step in more, and that means donors, of course, need to step up with more money, which is all of something we want to avoid. We also need to recognize, though, that we rely on the private sector, all of us. WFP, we don't own any aircraft, we don't own any ships, we hardly own any warehouses, we own about 5% of our trucking fleet. So everything we depend on relies on the private sector, right? Including, of course, for staff as well, that mobility of staff between the private sector in and out. And how do we really now work with the private sector in a different way? I really linked on to what Gwen Ping said about, about local responders, right? And that really needs to be, we know there's still a disconnect, right, between when we have an international response and how we localize that. We see that today. I think, Mervat, you brought up the point is vaccine hesitancy. We know that this is not over, right? And we also know as well that we stand at now a point in how do we move as quickly from the response of last year, which was like the Band-Aid as such, into the vaccine response, right? I would also say, and I would like to, how can I say, congratulate as well governments as well. One thing that we were majorly concerned last year was that a lot of governments would take the view of closing borders, insulating themselves, isolating themselves, which would have a huge impact on many of our supply chains. When we consider about Kenya being a supply for South Sudan and many other emergencies as well, Djibouti for Ethiopia and South Sudan, Douala for Central African Republic, all of those which we saw those maintained. So there's got to be a huge congratulations out to governments that they were forward-facing, they held up their responsibilities, and they allowed those supply chains to continue. Because if that had not happened, where we'd be standing today would be a very different place. One of the things that we feel that is very overlooked is the systems integration analytics. So moving 150,000 cubic meters around the world to 173 countries, setting up two new logistics bases from nothing, both in China and in Belgium, setting up linkages to 173 different organizations through APIs. Losing one package to today is a testament to the amount of data and the value of data. So one of the things that we were concerned about last year was not only that people would be asking where my cargo is, they would also be asking questions like, there's this lump of cargo on the tarmac and I don't know who it belongs to. None of those happened because a lot of the investment that we had made beforehand, again, I refer back to Guanping, when these investments need to be done beforehand, the value of preparedness. But one of the things that we feel is really overlooked is the whole data analytics things, how to ensure that you're analyzing data and making informed decisions around that. Because when you're dealing with an emergency of that complexity, then of course data becomes critical. And that regards end-to-end visibility, control towers, the different visibilities, how do you ensure, and again, it goes back to, through data, you can empower local actors when their cargo is arriving, who it's arriving to, and that really allows this shift to go from a very centralized system to a very decentralized system. And I'll show WFP as an example of that. When last year our headquarters was effectively shut down and we had the major point of surge was not working, we were able to work to the same level. In fact, we fed more people at any time during the organization's history, for a completely decentralized mechanism. So we have the technology to allow us to do that at this point. My second last point would be a huge congratulations to WHO last year. Yeah, one is, I think it was a tough year for them with the politicking behind this, the way they stepped up, the way they moved in, the way they took those blows and still went ahead and did this, the way they set up Geneva, and we had 17 to 20 people there at one time, I think does the organization a huge credit. And we really stand behind WHO and saying that we recognize that and we're really here to help them go forward. My last point would be, probably back as a kind of open question, back because I'm not going to answer every question, would be how do we feel about the design of the clusters today? Because in my point of view, when they were designed 10 or 15 years ago, it was very much around a country-led response, while last year we had a global response. So is the design of the cluster adequate for that global or even regional response, considering that these outbreaks will continue? And do we need to design them? And if we do need to design them, in which way? And I'll stop with that. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Stephen. And thanks also for concluding with, if I may say, a provocative comment or question. And I'm glad that also Wafaa is online also from Ocha. So maybe we'll circle back to this question. I'm sure a lot of colleagues online will have similar questions to raise on the cluster system, but we'll circle back to that in a minute. But thanks for highlighting a few quite critical, pieces. First, also highlighting again the brilliant and the critical work that WFP has really carried out in fielding this, I would say, probably the largest logistics operation of that magnitude or of that size ever. And doing it in a timely fashion and doing it, as you said, even without losing any cargo whatsoever, along the way, if I can say it in such simplistic terms. So really hats off to WFP, but also hats off, as you've mentioned, to the World Health Organization, because I know that there was also a strong, beyond everything else that the WHO has done, but also that strong partnership between WFP and WHO on setting up field hospitals, the medevac work as well. So really thanks to both organizations and all partners on the ground and the governments that made that, possible. It's interesting that because I know that WFP is really strong on preparedness work, and it's not a new area of work. This is ingrained part of WFP's DNA for many, many years. So thanks for reinforcing the point that Gwyn also raised around investing in preparedness and response with communities and governments and local actors as early as possible, because it does, pay off. But even with the strength of WFP's preparedness work and foresight, I would say, thanks for being honest about the areas where there were a number of unforeseen areas, including, as you mentioned, the speed by which, of course, the virus was spreading, the fact that at the epicenter, it was really a lot of the developing countries, not so much so at, in the humanitarian setting. So the equation sort of turned upside down. But even with that, WFP, WHO, the IASC family, and so many partners really stepped up to the challenge. So thanks for highlighting that. So interesting, the point around system integration and data analytics. And so I will actually probably circle back to you again, Stephen, at the end of this session to also ask you what's been done. Is there an infrastructure more or less that was built that we can capitalize on or that we can add to make sure that we do better as a system to strengthen data analytics that can affect, again, that will have ripple effects on many issues, not only around the logistics aspect, but as you pointed out, on the localization agenda and many, many other areas of work that we're all engaged in. So huge thanks again, Stephen, for highlighting these points. And with that, I'd like to turn to Jennifer. So Jennifer Nielsen, colleagues, again, is the Director of COVID-19 Response with World Vision International. Jennifer, one key aspect, and I know Stephen alluded to it as well, is the issue around funding. And also Wafaa from Ocha spoke about the importance of quality funding. So the provision of quality funding and funding at scale and at speed to frontline responders has been critical for a timely response to the COVID-19 crisis. And I am aware that the IASC has advocated strongly for this and worked closely with NGOs and the NGO community, as well as with donors, to achieve this. What are some of the lessons that we can draw from this experience, Jennifer, that you can share with colleagues online? Over to you, please.
Thank you so much. And just before, I know I just have about 5 minutes, so I'm just setting myself a timer to make sure I don't go over. But I just want to say how much I appreciate being on this panel with everyone. It's always so nice to hear such creative and intelligent and experienced voices from my colleagues. So thank you very much for the opportunity. And just as a preface, let me just give a very brief overview of what World Vision has done. We set ourselves a goal at the very beginning of the pandemic, actually just before the WHO declared the pandemic, World Vision declared a global response. And we committed to raising and spending $350 million in 70 countries with a goal of reaching 72 million people. And you can see down there we have 4 strategic objectives. Effectively, they address the health needs, but also the secondary impacts of COVID-19. Next slide, please. So you can see, I don't know if this is appearing a bit funny for anybody else, but I've got some, anyway, regardless. As of today, we've reached about 62 million people. A large portion of that is in preventative activities. But I want to point out actually three statistics down there towards the bottom. So one is 146,000. So we've reached 146,000 faith leaders. And we have developed a module, specifically 2 modules specifically for them, called Channels of Hope. One is about helping faith leaders spread prevention messages around COVID-19, and the other one is to promote vaccination. And I think that this is critically important and speaks to the funding question that you have, because these are existing networks we had, and because of the nature of World Vision's funding as both typical grant funding, but also private funding, we really were able to draw upon these existing models and reallocate some of our funding from activities that we were doing with this group towards COVID-19. The last thing I also wanted to point out on the end there, $112 million. So World Vision has an organization, an arm within it called Vision Fund. It's a microfinance institution. And we were able to give out about $112 million in loans to support recovery for communities that were dealing with COVID-19. And I think that this was an opportunity to use a mechanism that was designed for development programming in a much more predictable and stable world, and really turn that towards COVID-19 funding, COVID-19 programming rather. So one of the big lessons that we saw regarding funding was not just an opportunity to raise new funds, but also to sort of quickly reallocate and use our existing strengths to address the current situation and to sort of turn ourselves that way. Next slide. So World Vision did a real-time learning, and I'm going to speak to the findings of that. So this was at the end of last year. We spoke to 3,000 of our staff in 56 countries, as well as 500 external partners and 1,600 community members in 6 countries. So this was a very large opportunity for us to learn about what our programming had been doing. Next slide. And I just speak to a couple of the key takeaways from that. So we really saw that we leveraged our global footprint and our grassroots field presence. To give you an example of this, in Uganda, we had an existing program which was grant funded, where we had young refugees doing peace building activities in the refugee community in northern Uganda. But we were able to very quickly pivot those activities to have those young people give preventative messages about COVID-19. And fortunately, our donors were flexible enough to allow us to do that. And it was a very quick phone call. Those relationships that we had in the field with those donors, we were able to really just collaborate and work together to shift that funding. You can also see that when everyone was shutting down, private industry, governments, World Vision, and I think it's also fair to say a lot of our humanitarian counterparts, we stayed open and we continued to work with communities. We continued to do the work that we'd been doing. And I can give you, the third point there talks about how we listened and adapted. And I can give you an example of that as well. In Mexico, we saw that schools closed like they did everywhere else. And one of the problems that we saw was that teachers weren't able to photocopy the materials that they needed for their students. There was no facility for them to do that within their sort of existing structures. But we had a Xerox machine in our office, so we were able to allow teachers to come there, photocopy the materials they need, and share that with students. Now that is a simple, very low cost thing, but I think often we get stuck in, these modalities in our offices, say, no, this is for staff, or this is our office, and community programs happen out there. But there's really opportunities to have hyper-local, hyper-contextualized, not very expensive interventions that really make a huge difference. So, I can point to education programming that costs millions of dollars, and we can certainly speak to the efficacy of those programmings, but here's something that cost a couple $100 in paper and toner that I think really made a big impact and a big difference. Next slide, and this will be the last thing that I discuss. Sorry, the next one after that. Nope, one back. Apologies. The other direction. There we go. So just to say that there are some kind of key takeaways about funding, and I'll just speak to these three big pieces here. One is, again, visibility to changing context. Definitely that contextualization, making sure we had good data on the ground made a huge difference in terms of being able to have very specific interventions in place and being able to speak to donors and say, listen, this is a problem we see. World Vision has a barrier analysis strategy that we're rolling out right now to address vaccine hesitancy. And we can see on a very specific granular level the things that are causing people to choose to have a vaccine or not, what obstacles there may be, and we can then tailor our programming accordingly. And this is something that we're getting a big response to, not just to have these vague programs, but rather something that's highly contextualized. We also noticed that we were able to raise local funding. So this is a model that World Vision has been working on for quite a long time. And in the context where that's possible, we partnered with a lot of local organizations, the private sector, like Stephen mentioned, to raise funding locally and really address the needs of children in communities and have the community members themselves participate towards that. World Vision is in a very fortunate position in that we have this pool of sponsorship funding for child sponsorship. That's one of our fundraising and programming models. And our governance rules already state that in the case of an emergency, we can reallocate up to 20% of that funding for the emergency. And that's been extraordinarily helpful in the way that we've been able to not only leverage that funding, that money for other funding, but also to have quick responses to things. But that being said, there's always room for improvement. I think we've learned a lot, and this real-time learning was at the end of last year. Even in the 6 months since then, we've applied a lot of these lessons. I think that the big things are just simplifying frameworks for how we have funding, communicating strongly between communities, ourselves, government, and our donors and other stakeholders and partners. And also, I think that just being very creative and innovative in the kind of programming that we're doing. So again, I mentioned this Channels of Hope module, working with faith leaders. That's been extraordinarily effective. The barrier analysis has been great. So it's been a good learning experience, I think, for us, but also an opportunity for us to sort of take the machine that is our industry and that can be World Vision and sort of turn that to addressing this problem quickly. And I think a lot of what Stephen said resonates very well with me, in that we really, I feel, stepped up and have a lot to be proud of for how we dealt with this, pandemic, how we're dealing with this pandemic. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm happy to take any questions when they come.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and thanks particularly also for highlighting, the best practices and the lessons learned from World Vision. And again, as you've mentioned, a lot of the innovative solutions don't cost a lot of money, and a lot of it also relies on, as we've always said across the board, it's working with local communities, working with local actors. That seems to be the magic bullet that will help us, respond more effectively on the ground. Really intriguing that also you've done more around raising funds locally, because we always look externally. But again, I do believe that if the projects or the programs are, I would say, legitimate is a strong word, but if they are owned and there is trust and credibility around them locally, then indeed many of the countries where we're operating, there is a very generous community, whether it's the private sector or philanthropists or business individuals that can support the response and these programs and projects if indeed there is full awareness and knowledge of how critical they are in addressing the needs on the ground. I'm glad also you've raised a point around the importance of evidence and data, and I think it also speaks to the point, Stephen, that you've mentioned. And I think maybe perhaps also stepping back a little bit, Wafaa mentioned it around the critical work that the IASC members with partners have done, working also with local organizations to make sure that the evidence and the data was collated to produce this first ever global humanitarian response plan. We've never produced anything like this as a system, and we worked quickly. It was definitely challenging in many ways, but again, we were all united as a system to make sure that we had a quick understanding of the situation on the ground and a better grasp of what is needed to make sure that we have a clear picture of what's needed and what are the resources that are required to make sure that we're able to respond quickly. So with that, I know that there's also, WHO produced the strategic response plan, if I'm not mistaken, as well. And we won't go into that in much, detail. But the reason why, Peter, I wanted you to be the last to speak is because the earlier speakers really shared a visual of how the system responded. What worked well, what are the areas where we can do better, and there's always room for improvement. We are in a in a sector where we are always striving to do better and improve, especially around localization, especially around how we engage with local communities and be more accountable to affected people, especially around the data aspect, especially around duty of care, especially of local actors and local organizations that we're working with. So there's a lot that we've learned over the last year and a half. But I don't want also us to conclude, especially with participants online, to only speak to the successes and the lessons learned. I want to also make sure that we're all clear in terms of where do we go from here. So if you can, perhaps, Peter, just give us a visual of what you're seeing in terms of, if I can say so, a forecast of this pandemic. We're seeing it materialize, I would say, quite strongly in a lot of the contexts where we have humanitarian operations, or a lot of the fragile countries and humanitarian contexts. So what are you seeing, and what do we need to do more as a system to prevent a further deterioration of the vulnerabilities of these communities in these fragile countries and humanitarian settings? So over to you, please, Peter, before we open the floor for questions and comments.
Thanks, Mervat. Thanks, Ali, colleagues. Well, I have to say that, first of all, really nice to be with you. And I have sort of seen it at the two extremes, if I may. So, first of all, I work on the UN Crisis Management Team, which tries to bring together the principles of UN entities and make sure that, let's say, we are aligned at a global level. But also, I spent quite a bit of time back in Afghanistan, and therefore member of the HCT and UNCT. And I feel that one of the positives that I derive from all of this is that we're more functional and more aligned and better at working together and working to our comparative advantage than I've seen in a long, long time. Okay, so that's both within the UN, but also with the larger humanitarian community, etc. So I think one thing that I sincerely hope we won't lose is that spirit of collaboration. And even when you were mentioning the GHRP, the fact that actually we were working on it in the context of making sure that it was aligned both with the SPRP and with the socioeconomic framework that Robert Piper and his team were working on. So another thing that I think, first of all, congratulations, because so much of what I wanted to say was already said by Wafaa. So all of us have become public health, if not experts, at least aware. And that's, I really mean it as a compliment to all. And it shows that, and I hope again, going forward, that health remains on the agenda for all of us, because it touches on so many things in society. But it also means that, let's say, as a health agency, we have to understand that there's a lot of externalities and a lot of inputs into health that are actually not coming out of the health world. So what this pandemic has shown us is that, let's say, the fault lines in society, the vulnerabilities became even stronger and worse, and that therefore a purely health-focused response doesn't work. So as the pandemic itself, and I know that, and I heard a lot about vaccination, and of course, ultimately vaccination will be the solution, but for the time being, it's only part of the solution, and therefore the public health measures, proper care for those who get sick, testing of those who might have caught the virus, staying away from each other, masking in public spaces, etc., has to remain part of the agenda. And and I know it's hard, and I know that people are tired of it, but it has to remain. And of course, what is also shown is that the global, let's say, we as a group, I think, work very nicely together, but the world hasn't really worked nicely together, especially not when it comes to vaccination. I mean, we're really now going globally in a two-tier system. Tedros has spoken very vocally and openly about this, and it's sad. It's sad that those most at need in resource limited settings are so far behind in the queue when it comes to vaccination. It's a real global problem, which I think will lead to solutions, because as later today there will be an event here where we're talking about opening capacity in South Africa around very modern vaccine production technology, and I think it's something that's going to come. I think Asia, Latin America, Africa will not accept that they don't have access to capacities. But the pandemic isn't over, and in many places things will get worse, are getting worse before they will get better. The initial response, and I think Stephen spoke to that, the irony was that rich countries were hit very hard. Countries that have so many other problems on their plate and therefore have to practice response to other diseases and other crises were much better in the initial phase than rich countries, and more practical, more agile. But of course, there comes a point that you get overwhelmed, and unfortunately we see that in many settings, and we really worried about Africa at this point in time. I remember from West Africa that we were very almost shyly working on community engagement, and I'm so happy that that Gwen and others spoke about that being at the core of it. We just came out of the World Health Assembly, and we're very happy with the overall response from member states around the importance of public health, etc. But too many of the solutions being tabled are so-called global solutions, global networks, global centers, when we all know that actually the real action is at national level and below, and especially at the local level. And when it comes to the issues around vaccine hesitancy, but also alerts when it comes to signals of strange new diseases, etc., it's the local communities that have to and will act for themselves. And we have to find the way to create the support structures that Gwen spoke to. She also spoke to risk communication, and I think many spoke to the fact that in addition to this pandemic being a public health problem, it has also become an information, how do you call this, the disaster in many ways. I think Stephen and others spoke to data. I think the Twitters and Facebooks of this world, I think we were vastly underprepared to deal with both the good information that you can impart through those channels and the bad information that is being imparted by very savvy people. And therefore work around risk communication is going to be a major, major undertaking that we collectively have to work on. If possible, maybe not now, but at some later stage, if there's going to be discussion about cluster design, I would like to be part of that. Based on prior experience elsewhere, I think we have to be more agile in terms of configurations that are most suitable for the problems that we face. So I would definitely go there as well. But to wrap up, so if we go sort of look inward, so first of all, this is not only a public health problem, this is especially a problem that touches society overall and the vulnerable, especially in every aspect that we see. And that's the very reason why WHO actually requested the Secretary General very early in February, please set up the UN Crisis Management Team, because this is not a public health issue. Then when it comes to public health, the terrible disruption of services, vaccination, maternal and child health, mental health services, in many countries terribly disrupted, and therefore the number of deaths because of other diseases vastly outstrips that of COVID at this point, just as we had in West Africa with Ebola. And then when it comes to vaccination, the problem of the two-tier system, the fact that COVAX is actually a system that is, if properly resourced, can function very adequately, but at this point in time doesn't get the resources to live up to its potential. And therefore, I think we do need a continued advocacy and pressure from civil society, from member states that let's say don't have the necessary resources to get an equal share of the vaccines available, at least for the frontline health workers and for the most vulnerable as a start this year. Back to you, Mervat.
Thanks a million, Peter, and quite sobering actually to learn that mortality as a result of other diseases and health-related issues actually is outstripping that of mortality from COVID. So that's actually, it speaks to what we were referring to earlier, which is, again, these medium and long-term impacts of COVID. Because again, if we're operating or we're looking at countries, fragile countries or humanitarian settings where health or public health systems are already stretched, and in response to COVID, they've had to divert the limited capacities and resources that they have to respond to COVID, has happened at the expense of providing regular public health services to the population. So again, quite alarming to hear that again, the mortality rates as a result have increased considerably and have outstripped that of the COVID. I want to perhaps, Peter, just to complement what you've mentioned. The data may be a little bit outdated because I haven't had the chance, unfortunately, to look at the figures before I got online. But based on the COVID-19 Data Explorer, which I understand is also produced, of course, with partners and with Ocha, as of May, over a third of countries with humanitarian response plans have recorded more cases in the first 4 months of 2021 than the whole of 2020. A third of the countries where there are humanitarian response plans have recorded more cases of COVID-19 in the first 4 months of this year than the whole of 2020. So again, it speaks to how the incidence of, or the spread of the virus in many of the contexts or in the countries where we are operating is on the rise, and it's on the rise significantly. Also, of the 18.6 million new cases globally reported in April, Over 7.2 million were in countries covered by the Global Humanitarian Overview. So this is, again, just to give a sense of the fact, which is obviously clear, but also to re-emphasize it, that the crisis is far from over. And it speaks again, Peter, to your point that there more needs to be done that around the equitable access to vaccines, especially also in these countries, to minimize both the immediate as well as these medium and long-term impacts. Also, to give you a sense, according to the World Bank forecast, by the end of 2021, an additional 19.4 million people will be pushed into extreme poverty in 17 countries with a humanitarian response plan. So we're talking about poverty levels increasing. We have seen or heard, of course, of the threat or the concerns around famine in a number of countries, and many other issues and concerns that we have to be alert to and responsive to as well. Okay, so colleagues, thanks so much again for the rich feedback that you provided as panelists. And I see there are a number of questions that have come in through the chat box, including from Yusra with the Humanitarian Forum. A key question maybe first to you, Jennifer, around the financing instruments. Are there any reports that highlight the innovative ways in coordinating and using different financial instruments collectively? I know, of course, Jennifer, you spoke about the excellent examples from the World Vision, but are there any thoughts or any visual of innovative ways or any reports that you might be aware of to coordinate the use of different financial instruments collectively? It would be great to get your thoughts on that. And then I'd like perhaps to turn to, actually, before I turn to Peter, because Peter, you just spoke, but just a heads up that the question that I'll be directing to you is around the second part of Yusra's question, which is, can you shed light on current collective plans for building back better and resilience building? I know this is a question, honestly, that applies to all of our panelists, but perhaps, Peter, if you can share some initial thoughts, that would be fantastic. I want to circle again also back to you, Wafaa, on the question around the cluster system. And again, it's a cluster system has been established around 15 years ago, if I'm not mistaken now, approximately 15 years ago. It, of course, tends to look at country-specific responses. And in dealing with the COVID as a global crisis, any thoughts, Wafaa, that you can share in terms of, the relevance of the cluster system in light of today's world, given both Stephen and Peter's comments? That would be really greatly appreciated. And then I'll go to Stephen on the question. It was more a question, I know, that Stephen, that you posed to the panelists, or an open question around the importance of data analytics and integrated systems. So any thoughts, if you can shed light on what systems you've put in place to make sure that WFP and partners were able to put in place this robust logistics global operation that we can learn from or build on, would be really greatly appreciated. So perhaps, Jennifer, can we start with you, and then we'll turn to Wafaa, and then Stephen, and then we'll conclude with Peter. Over to you, please, Jennifer.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mervat. So first of all, I put two links there in the chat box. One is a link to World Vision's real-time learning report that I referenced, and the other one goes to a page that has all of our publications, including our 1 year on report. And the reason I've done that is because in both of those places, you'll find some nice visuals and some information about how our internal funding looks like as World Vision. Now, the reason I'm sharing that with you and not something that speaks to the larger humanitarian world is, frankly, that there are not very many good resources that help to talk about what the sort of pipeline looks like, what funding prospects are. It's all very ad hoc. My experience during the pandemic has been that it's been highly relational in terms of how funding how funding opportunities were shared, how different MOUs were developed, or how partnerships were created. And that's actually, I hope, something that we all walk away from this experience thinking about how we can, I think, collaborate better when it comes to fundraising and when it comes to funding. There's been a real confusion, I think, in the way the information has been has been shared and the way that funding has been prioritized, particularly when it comes to funding, as one of the other panelists mentioned, preventative activities. I think we've maybe dropped the ball a little bit on that as we started really strongly with those in the beginning, and now everyone's so excited about the vaccine, we've kind of forgotten that for the vast majority of the world, things like social distancing and masking are still going to make a big difference. So thank you very much.
Great, super helpful, Jennifer. And perhaps with that, we can turn to Wafaa. Actually, is it okay, Wafaa, to come in on the cluster issue? Great, thank you so much.
So first, I would like also to share that the interagency, there's going to be an interagency humanitarian evaluation for the COVID-19 response. So there's going to be consultation in an expansive, systematic way, and we'll also learn from that, and that's already initiated. Because I think also this whole session about lessons learned. And I think, yes, there has been a lot of discussion about the cluster coordination model versus the realities that we have of today. And I wouldn't say that the answer is now a bit like conclusive, because this has to be also a collective discussion. But I want to share with you some of the issues that have been coming out when we have this discussion and question the clusters. The clusters brought with them the issue about accountability and technical expertise. And I will give you, for example, I spent some time, my most recent field was in Ethiopia earlier this year for 3 months. And I think you could turn to an agent to say, we have a problem of water, mobilize the technical expertise and get that. So that where you could have an entity that has a technical expertise and accountability is something that's still working, and we have to say what to do with it. I think in many different contexts, we've been seeing that we have to move into what is called area-based coordination, where we find in many places the coordination is not focused on the clusters, but it's organized about the population in a given place, what are their needs, and so we all come and converge, and not necessarily everybody has something to contribute, but it's around the population in that specific area. And also, for example, in South Sudan, we've seen that now what we call field coordination, where it is beyond the subnational level, and the agency that leads is the partner who have more capacity in that area, regardless, it could be many places the NGO, and in many places maybe a frontline humanitarian partner or national NGO, and they are leading, and then, for example, others are supporting them. So we have moved because of this necessity. We have to work in a way that put people at the center. So we have seen a bit of that. We've also seen a bit of progress in the way that we are assessing needs. We've moved from these are the needs for only wash to the needs of the people. What are their survival needs? What are their mental health needs? What are their well-being needs? And we've seen also the introduction to this joint analysis framework that is also being assessed by a study that is engaged in Yale University. So I think this is something that we have to continue collectively, and I think that COVID-19 has some. So I don't have a conclusion to say, oh, we have to do away with the cluster, because we have to think, what do we do about the technical expertise, accountability, but yet how do we put people at the center and use the capacities and also use the frontline responders? So that's what I would say on this, Merve. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Wafaa, and again, thanks for also highlighting that there will be an interagency humanitarian evaluation on the scale-up response to COVID, where I'm sure a lot of these issues also will be brought to the surface, and hopeful that very concrete recommendations will be presented in consultation with the IASC members and partners to make sure that we're better prepared and to respond to humanitarian situations in general, but also the possibility of future pandemics as well. Thanks, Wafaa. And maybe with that, I'd like to turn to Stephen on the data analytics component. Over to you, please, Stephen.
Thank you. So where do I think? I think from my background, which is not in technology at all, right? So I consider myself a complete amateur in this, but I know what I want, right? Like a lot of us do. I think we have a golden opportunity because technology has moved on. We have the ability now to pull data from multiple sources. So 10 years ago, we would have been talking about how do you build a system that can provide a solution to everybody, right? Today, you're talking about how do we connect systems. So everybody can have systems, multiple systems. WFP probably has 10 or 12 different systems, which now we're quite comfortable working with. We use SAP for our centralized system today. We're talking about, actually, do we really need a centralized system? Can we work in a much more decentralized manner? So that allows, for me, the big change is not about how we change business, but how does technology allow us to decentralize? And it goes back to the point about, why do you want to decentralize? Why do we go back to as local as possible, as international as necessary, is how do we enforce the local side? And we have that ability today through technology. But that requires a mental change on people going, how do you let go? Right? I remember discussions 5 or 7 years ago where people talk about, how can you let cash into hands of beneficiaries, because we never know what they're going to do with it. We have the ability now to actually understand how people use cash, and therefore, how can I say, reinsure about ways we're working. But it really does allow us push down to that critical decision making, down from a level which is centralized, global, down to the local level. And I think that's the change. So are organizations willing now to use technology to allow that? Are they willing to let go of that control mechanisms to put them down? Because technologically, we can do it. But it requires, then when we talk about, there's a lot of things that then go around the hard work of standardization, right? So how do you consider, for example, again, my area is not in health, but I do know some basics around it, about data quality. So how do you ensure that what WHO calls a glove, or the many different types of gloves they have, surgical gloves, examination gloves, I don't know, latex, whatever else, and how do you make sure that other organizations have the same standardized wording for those same items? So there's a lot of work that can be done, but again, data allows you to not to have to do a lot of the standardization, but allows systems to talk to each other to allow that data exchange. So I think really we have an opportunity now, which if we want to take it, it really allows us to change things. And that change is, we can actually reinforce localization.
Great. Many thanks, Stephen. And I know that there is actually quite a bit of work around data sharing and data responsibility, and there are various MOUs or partnership agreements between different organizations to strengthen these components. But as you pointed out, we have a way to go around the analytical component of it as well. So as we gather data, how do we use it or analyze it or triage information to make sure that it is useful and is acted in a timely fashion, acted upon in a timely fashion. And a big component of it is also around, how do we make sure that we manage data, including sensitive data, in a very careful way to make sure that we do no harm along the way. And I know there is also great IASC guidance that was produced on that particular issue, which I know Ali will be sharing or has already shared in the chat box as well. So thanks again, Stephen, for saying a few words on that. So perhaps with that, I'd like to turn to Peter. Also, any thoughts you might have? Sorry to put you on the spot. I know it's a big question around collective plans for building back better, and any resilience building thoughts, if any, that you can share. And I would like to turn afterwards to Gwen to share. As a matter of fact, Gwen, if it's okay with you, I will give the floor to a colleague from Geneva, Call, who would like to say a few words also around the situation of civilians living in territories controlled by armed groups, and how we're able to respond in these types of contexts, which are quite many. So I'll give the floor to Ezekiel, if I'm not pronouncing your word correctly, and then we'll conclude, Gwen, with your thoughts. And I would love to hear your concluding thoughts at the end of the session, because I know we have 6 minutes to go. Any final thoughts, advice, reflections from your end would be wonderful to hear from you before we end this session. But first to Peter, and then to Ezekiel, and then over to Gwen. Over to you, please, Peter.
Okay, so I'll keep it very brief, given the time. So the things that I would like to see in terms of building back better are that the collaboration between the humanitarian and development spheres is maintained. In any humanitarian settings, or in most humanitarian settings, there's development opportunities. And what we have seen is that there are humanitarian issues in many so-called more development-oriented environments that need tackling. And I think that I really hope that as a UN we can utilize that. Then the Robert Piper's group is working on with the RC system, etc. So hopefully all of the, at least the UN side of this call is aware of this, working on building back greener, meaning how do we utilize this shock and the fact that hopefully there will be substantial investments made to support countries get back to a normal that is not the old normal, but a new normal that is a more sustainable, forward-looking normal. And I already mentioned the issue around local production as one opportunity. Then another thing I'd like to share is when it comes to, let's say, building back better, that's not a post-pandemic activity. That's a now activity. We have to start now, because the moment it's all over, maybe attention will wane. Now there is interest. So I spoke to people of UNDRR, the disaster risk reduction, and they were sort of politely asking, when do you think there might be a moment for us to come in? And I really pushed, please do that now. If you look at health, the health sector in particular, at a national level, I think emergency operations centers, whole of government, whole of society, meaning that there is a system and a space where all actors come together, physical or otherwise, and practice against what hopefully won't come again, but unfortunately likely will. The investments that we currently have in lab and surveillance capacity, we spoke about it in the context of West Africa before, and only very partly succeeded to make sure that some of that capacity was kept after the Ebola outbreak. I sincerely hope that very fundamental public health investment is maintained. And last but absolutely not least, that all of this is anchored in community-based action, that it's brought back to the community, as Gwen has indicated so clearly, and that this is also looked at in the context of information, communication, and risk communication, as we need to get on the forefoot when it comes to sharing information with the global population. Back to you.
Halas, thank you, Peter. And in the interest of time, I'll just go straight to Ezekiel. Ezekiel, we have 2 minutes, and I want to make sure that I also give the chance for Gwen to conclude the session as well. So please, over to you briefly. Over to you, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm gonna thank you very much for this, and it's been a great panel. Just 1 minute. My name is Ezekiel Efes. I'm a senior legal advisor at Geneva Call. Geneva Call is a humanitarian organization that engages armed non-state actors on humanitarian norms, including on issues related to the protection and provision of healthcare. And just 2 points that I wanted to share is that last year, we saw many different armed non-state actors, some groups adopting measures that are similar to those of states. So imposing lockdowns, curfews, even asking for testing kits and vaccinations. And I mean, bearing in mind that there are between 60 and 80 million people living in the territories controlled by these armed non-state actors, I would like to highlight the need to continue the humanitarian engagement with these actors in order to actually ensure that the population living in the territories that they control or influence reach the vaccine. This is actually the only way that we see for the equitable access to vaccine to actually be ensured. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thanks a million, Ezekiel. And honestly, this merits a full session by itself. Again, vulnerable communities in non-government controlled areas, how are we able to access and ensure also their access to vaccine, as well as assistance and protection in general. But a really important point, Ezekiel, and thanks so much for coming in and mentioning briefly, highlighting briefly this important point, but to be continued. With that, over to you, Gwen, the final points, highlights, advice from your end before we conclude. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mervet. Thank you very much, colleagues. Well, I would like to bring back the conversation to the localization agenda. Well, I think to move forward with that, I would like to discuss 2 things. Number 1 is actually the need to come together, to have a cohesive approach, how we can frame this, because it is important how we're able to be the voice of the local actors, so that they will be able to receive the support, receive the the support that they needed. So sometimes donors and partners, they not sometimes, it's most of the donors and partners, they want to solve humanitarian problems. And localization, when we pitch it as an end of itself and an act of justice and empowerment, I don't think that is what the donor would like to hear from us and the partners, right? They are driven not by kindness, but by strategic interests. So we should be able to help get that message out, to the partners. And localization should have spoken to strategic interests. But, of course, we have to, choose a more, defense pitch that will help with the partner to invest. And because this is our commitment together with them, how we can move ahead and move forward with the localization agenda. And I think the second one I want to do on the localization agenda is the need to have a renewed commitment to put communities and local action at the center of public health emergency prevention and preparedness and response. Not to look at the local actors and communities as recipient of care, but they should be a real partner. They should be a real partner on the ground. So this will require a true and genuine partnership among local and international actors, where the leadership, knowledge, and capacities of the communities, local organization, and authorities are genuinely respected and empowered. Also, it is, it means that that large international organizations must streamline, slim down, and be more agile to redirect more resources to community-based responders, supporting community health systems and infrastructures whereby the people can truly own and trust, these initiatives. So communities and actors are key in managing and ending the pandemic, and I hope you will agree on that, because we could not reach, the places where we have reached without them. So we have to make communities and actors, as I've said, a strategic partner and invest in them now. So let us have this discussion beyond this meeting, or beyond this side meeting, or side session. So thank you very much, Mervet, for that opportunity, and we look forward for our continued discussion on this one as we renew our commitment on the localization agenda. Thank you.
Excellent, Gwen. Thank you so much. And this is really a fantastic way to conclude the session. The response to the COVID pandemic, I think many of us would agree, has shown the brilliance of the system when it comes together and in a collaborative and a coordinated fashion, but it also highlighted once again some of the fault lines or the areas that still require serious change and a catalytical, I would say, reform or shifts, including around how we're can be more accountable to affected people and how we can drive forward the localization agenda. So thanks so much again, Gwen, for concluding the session with these strong messages, and huge thanks to all of our panelists, Peter, WHO, Jennifer, World Vision, Stephen, World Food Program, and also Wafaa from Ocha, as well as all of the colleagues from the IASC Secretariat that made this session possible. And huge thanks to all of the participants that made the time and shared their reflections during the session. For many discussions to come and for many changes to come, inshallah, collaboratively and together. Many thanks, colleagues. Wishing you a good day.